Okay, we're going to begin our presentation. I'd like to welcome all of you to the Statutory and Regulatory Requirements, Anticipating Expectations Within a Quality Management System, ISO 9001 Audit. My name is Joseph Krolikowski, and I am the QMS Program Manager for PJR, as well as a member of our Executive Committee. Couple of notes for everyone. All of our participants today are on mute, but we absolutely would like to address your questions, so please make use of the question portion of the dashboard. We will address your questions at the end of our presentation. One of the more common questions that we get is, will we be able to review this webinar later? And the short answer to that is yes. We will definitely provide you with a copy of the presentation slides. Those will be available for download shortly after we're finished. And additionally, we will provide you a chance to review the webinar with voiceover on our website. If you look for the link previously recorded webinars, the slides will be available for reviewing in that manner as well. Our presentation for today is going to cover the following topics. We're going to go over what are statutory and regulatory requirements. We're going to be looking at these kind of from a scholastic point of view initially. We're going to address why PJR is incorporating statutory and regulatory requirements in the context of an ISO 9001 audit. We're going to review where statutory and regulatory requirements are addressed in both the 2008 and 2015 versions of ISO 9001. I have a couple of examples of statutory and regulatory requirements that might come up in an audit, a few concluding remarks, and then your questions. So first of all, statutory and regulatory requirements. We'll begin with the definitions. Now, these definitions are both taken from the ISO 9000 standard. This is, of course, the fundamentals and vocabulary document. Statutory requirement is defined as an obligatory requirement specified by a legislative body. Regulatory requirement is similar. It is an obligatory requirement specified by an authority mandated by a legislative body. So they're very, very similar. The key to understanding the difference is to understand where the requirements come from. Statutory requirements, as the name would imply, come from statutes. They are legal requirements that come from laws passed by state and or federal government bodies, such as Congress. Regulatory requirements are going to come from regulations. Now, these are going to be things like EPA requirements, OSHA requirements, FDA, FAA, FCC, DOT, and so forth. These are going to be generally rules that have been issued by these agencies to which the government has given the authority to regulate some industry or to do something. And they can often be found in the Code of Federal Regulations, or CFR. So, for example, the FDA is statutorily authorized to regulate food and drug safety through the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Safety Act. Now, to dig into more specific requirements, you would look to Title 21 of the CFR, the regulations that are issued by the FDA in order to help them fulfill their statutory authority to regulate. So to try to simplify it, basically you need to think of statutes as the law, and they are often going to be very general. Regulations are going to represent rules that are developed to interpret the law and ensure that we stay within the law, and are typically going to be more specific. So again, to give you an example, you may have a statute that says excessive levels of certain pollutants shall not be permitted in or near major bodies of water. The EPA would then issue regulations that are going to say, what do we mean by excessive levels? What constitutes a major body of water? And so forth. And often that regulation will also discuss what is the plan for enforcement in terms of what Congress intended by passing that statute. So getting back to macro, many of you are probably wondering, well, okay, I can get my arms around all of that, but why is PJR including statutory and regulatory requirements in the context of an ISO 9001 audit? Well, the short version is we are compelled to do so. We are held accountable to a number of requirements in our work as an accredited certification body. And perhaps the most important of these requirements is the ISO 17021 standard. That's you can think of that as kind of the ISO 9001 standard for certification bodies like PJR. Now that standard, its 2015 revision, there's a clause in there that reads in part, auditing shall include the client's management system ability and its performance regarding the meeting of applicable statutory and regulatory requirements. Now, where in the standard do we find references to these requirements? Of course, it is still an ISO 9001 audit, and we need appropriate requirements at play for this to be applicable. In the 2008 version of the standard, there were three requirements that were applied for statutory and regulatory requirements. The first of these was in section 5.1a, where it established a requirement for management to provide communication to the organization at large about the importance of meeting statutory and regulatory requirements, essentially management kind of leading the charge, so to speak, on the S&R requirements. A little bit further in the standard, in section 7.2, we have a requirement for including statutory and regulatory requirements among the items determined by the organization during the contractual phase with your customers. So when you are determining what the customer needs, what you're going to be making for them or providing to them, to include statutory and regulatory requirements as part of the overall picture so that you've got your arms around what the expectations are. And then lastly, in section 7.3, there is a requirement to include statutory and regulatory items in the design inputs when you're designing a product. So 3 places in ISO 9001 2015, or 2008 rather. Now in 2015, it grew to 6 places. And the first of these is going to be almost exactly the same as what we looked at in the 2008 version of the standard. Still a requirement that management lead the charge. Management ensures that S&R requirements are determined, are understood, and are consistently met. The second one is also similar. This whole idea that you include statutory and regulatory requirements among the items determined during the contractual phase. It is furthered a bit by our third bullet point here. You'll note that the clause prefix is almost exactly the same. It is re-mentioned that you will review S&R requirements prior to committing to supply a product or service to a customer. So determine what they are and then review them before you make a firm commitment to supply something to the customer. Then in 833C, we have again a requirement that statutory and regulatory requirements be included among the design inputs. And then the 2 new items that were added for 2015. First, that you ensure that your external providers, suppliers, subcontractors, and so forth do not adversely affect your compliance with S&R requirements. And finally, if post-delivery activities apply to you, that you ensure that S&R requirements are included in determining the extent of applicable post-delivery activities. In other words, is there some aspect of an S&R requirement that compels you to provide post-delivery activities for your particular product line? So in terms of how PJR has approached this requirement, we have created a special grid that appears in the audit report to record our assessments. And we have instructed our auditors to ensure that they are sampling applicable S&R requirements at every audit. We've told them that this needs to be looked at minimum a single line item per audit. So what are some of the more common examples of statutory and regulatory requirements? Well, we've picked 3 of the most common items to include in our presentation here. First of all, OSHA, the Occupational Health and Safety Act. Now these requirements, as I'm sure most of our folks on the call here are aware, are going to touch on a wide variety of areas. They're going to touch on personal protective equipment, on ergonomics. It may get into safety training and things of this nature. It is very, very common that there are going to be applicable OSHA requirements particularly in a production environment. Some of our guests on the call today may already be familiar with ITAR requirements, International Traffic in Arms Regulations. This is a set of requirements that are issued by the U.S. State Department, and they touch on areas such as controlled access to the facility, controlled access to records, and so forth, often in the aerospace or defense industries. Safety data sheets. These were formerly called material safety data sheets. These requirements are going to often apply to handling or use or disposal of chemical-based products. Now this could come up with product cleaning materials, product packaging, could get into raw materials, and so forth. And I'm sure you can conceive of how this might have an effect or an impact on how you orient your production area, how you control certain processes, and so forth. So how is the auditor supposed to determine what applies? Well, we've instructed our auditors that there are a number of things that they are already reviewing that potentially are going to reflect on statutory and regulatory requirements. They're already looking at contracts that you have with your customers, orders that you get from your customers. There's going to be often fine print or terms and conditions, things that are going to make reference to applicable statutory and regulatory requirements. The blueprints for the products that are being manufactured, the specifications for the products that are being manufactured. Often these items include references to applicable S&R requirements. In some cases, we can even look to your website for some clues on what the applicable requirements are going to be. Again, this is to be treated as not a standalone item, but as an item that is integrated into the larger activity of the audit. Now, I also want to give some assurance that there are necessary limits to our assessment. We've emphasized to our auditors that the audit process is limited to confirming that the auditee has effective processes in place for identifying and complying with the relevant statutory and regulatory requirements. So again, I'll remind you of the wording from 17021. Include the client's management system ability and performance regarding the meeting of applicable statutory and regulatory requirements. So to put that a bit more plainly, our job is to ensure that you have an effective process for identifying and implementing what applies to you, not to audit specific line items therein. We're not OSHA auditors, we're not EPA auditors. Our job is limited, our task is limited as it pertains to statutory and regulatory requirements. Here's a couple examples of how the report might look in the finished audit reports. I mentioned OSHA and ITAR. So here's an example of how that report might look. If it was OSHA, we might say that we confirmed appropriate postings. We saw safety content within the training records. If it was ITAR, we might say that we confirmed a sign-in protocol. We saw locks on cabinets. We saw control on ITAR regulated product, and so forth. I've actually put in one more example here, DFARS requirements. These have to do with domestic sourcing of raw materials, again, associated typically with aerospace companies. Confirm that all suppliers used for raw materials and finishing services are domestic sources. So straightforward, simple, and again, the intent is that this is not a standalone item. This isn't going to get its own line item on the audit plan. This is going to be adjunct, so to speak, to the regular audit of your processes. Now you're probably wondering, is it possible or conceivable that you might get a nonconformance as a result of a statutory and regulatory or regulatory requirement? Well, it is conceivable that a nonconformance would be issued if there is a disconnect between your process and the applicable SNR requirement. But again, we've instructed our auditors to exercise a bit of discretion by asking themselves two key questions. Does the issue impact customer satisfaction or the attainment of a quality objective? Does it impede your ability to manufacture your product or render your service? If the answer to those questions is no, chances are very good that we would not be writing a nonconformance. If the nonconformance is warranted, the auditor must ensure that the requirements cited include the appropriate clause from either the 2008 or 2015 version of ISO 9001. So in conclusion, we want to ensure that we are providing our clients with a value-added audit and meeting all applicable requirements. We do hope that the points of this presentation will help you develop a better understanding of what our expectations are for statutory and regulatory requirements. I'd like to invite you to tune in for one of our other webinars. We have a presentation called The Interaction of Processes and Its Importance to a Successful Audit. This one is shown on a quarterly basis. It explores the crucial topic of processes and how to correctly understand them. We also have a presentation called Non-Applicable Clauses, Permissible Exclusions, Exemptions, developing a better understanding of what can and what cannot be excused in an audit assessment. That's also shown quarterly. We've got some interesting information in there about exemptions and the right way to approach those exemptions. And we have webinars on a variety of other topics. We have webinars for Stage 1, for ISO 9001, for IETF 16949, and for a variety of other areas. We would love to be able to keep in touch with you, and the best way for us to do that is if you opt in. If you visit our website at www.pjr.com, go to the bottom of the page, input your email address, and click subscribe. You will be opted in for future updates from PJR on upcoming webinars and other points of information. I do thank you for your time and attention today. At this time, I'm going to unlock the questions portion of the dashboard and address your questions. Are there any questions today? Okay, thank you for your time. Have a great day.